Hey there, it's me Ben. I'm back at college, and I've been thinking a lot about retrofuturism lately. The Jetsons indoors is one of the most popular examples of post-war American futurism. It seems to be most often remembered for the fantastic technology. We tend to think of Orbit City as utopia, but is it? I mean, yeah, it is. Of course, narratively, it serves as a utopia. This isn't some fan theory where we're gonna try to, claim that the Earth is secretly irradiated or whatever. It's a utopia, but unlike something like Star Trek, it's not particularly aspirational. While a lot of things are more convenient in the future, a lot of the problems of modernity still persist. Sure, there's flying cars, but there's still traffic jams. George seems to tire out as easy as someone who works a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah. Those 3-hour work days are killing me.
Sure, the Jetsons have a robot servant, but she's sentient and still has all the same emotional needs as a human maid. Crime and income inequality still exists. The people work for money, so clearly this isn't like a post-scarcity world or anything like that. And the extreme whiteness of the Spacebird shows us that in the future, racism and segregation continue to be a problem in housing. Sure, in the future a lot of things are better, but people don't seem to be, on the whole, all that much happier. The overall quality of life seems to be roughly today's, or the 1960s version of today's. The more you look at it, the more the shag carpety musk of the 60s is all over this far-flung future. It's to the point that, from a modern perspective, it barely seems like the future at all. It's a world where we've made incredible achievements in technology, but society still remains fundamentally stuck in America right after World War II. The Jetsons takes its main joke from its sister show, The Flintstones. Well, not directly a spin-off, both shows were produced by Hanna-Barbera, and both were shown on primetime. They both shared distinct art styles, tone, and even eventually crossed over in a kind of Hanna-Barbera shared universe. The main conceit of The Flintstones is that they look like Ega, but act like the Honeymooners. Most of the humor derives from the dissonance caused by this anachronism of imposing, at the time, contemporary societal structure onto a world that's anything but contemporary. Fred's a construction worker like we see in the modern day, but instead of an excavator, he uses a brachiosaur, for instance. It's Rock Vegas. Your ability to tolerate that one joke told over and over will largely indicate your enjoyment of the Flintstones. Cool burn on the Flintstones, dude. The Jetsons gives us essentially that same joke, but in reverse.
Oh, look, Jane, we're here. Las Vegas.
While the Flintstones saw the ideal of the post-war atomic family imposed in the Stone Age, the Jetsons imposes it on the Space Age. Combined, these shows attempt to normalize the American post-war white middle-class suburban family lifestyle. They present families living like Leave It to Beaver as the default across all time and space, natural to human existence. The ethos of these shows is highly conservative and normative. But in reversing the time period, the anachronism of the Jetsons takes on a different character. While the Flintstones was clearly fantastical and parodic, the aesthetics of the Jetsons mirrored what many people in the 60s thought was just around the corner. This is the future that was promised by GM in the World's Fairs and Walt Disney. And the space race made a future of mass interstellar transit seem imminent, assuming we didn't nuke ourselves out of existence. While the Flintstones reimagined a past that could never be, the Jetsons imagined a future that could come. This gives the Jetsons a slight subversive edge. Well, shows like Star Trek imagine a future where issues like war and racism and income inequality are things of the past. The Jetsons insist that these problems will persist even as technology advances. The Jetsons does ultimately reject the utopian notion that technological advancement necessarily brings societal advancement. And there's something quietly radical about that. In this regard, one could generously read Jetsons as a proto-cyberpunk text. Cyberpunk typically contrasts a technologically advanced future with a decrepit society. Blade Runner, for instance, juxtaposes a future with robots and flying cars with issues of income inequality, urban decay and filth, rampant corporatism, dehumanization, and slavery. While novels and short stories by Isaac Asimov and Philip K. Dick were pioneering the genre in the 60s, the Jetsons added an interesting, lighthearted take on its core ideas. Obviously, Jetsons didn't tackle issues nearly as serious as later cyberpunk texts, nor did it take itself nearly as seriously, nor was it ever explicit in any of its critiques of capitalism or anything like that, but I think there is something to note here. In her book, Shanghai Future, Modernity Remade, Anna Greenspan views the Jetsons as a direct precursor to cyberpunk of the 1980s. She theorizes that by repositioning the post-war future as something to be laughed at, it helped disillusion the public with this utopian vision. She states, "On the one hand, it offered a comforting projection of the model of the American family into the future, the Jetsons also poked fun at the social structures that wanted to be considered eternal, but were already in the process of being revolutionized." 20 years later, in the early 1980s, with the emergence of cyberpunk, the science fiction vision of the future imploded. The clean, glistening projection of the future that was far, far away was dismissed as absurd. In its place, cyberpunk sought to depict a future that was up close and dirty, pushing up against us at the edge of tomorrow. Doesn't that future but not quite futureness sound a little bit familiar? The big thing that separates the Jetsons from later cyberpunk texts is the lack of marginalization as the core theme. Typically, cyberpunk texts show technology as something that separates us from humanity, driving wedges between classes and marginalized groups. This goes against a Marxist reading of history, where technological advancement will help us progress to the abolishment of classes and capital, and thus lead to humanity's ultimate emancipation. Don't get me wrong, comrades, I'm for humanity's ultimate emancipation, but I don't think technology is the way we're gonna achieve it. Well, Star Trek, for instance, buys into this utopian notion of technological advancement. Cyberpunk tends to reject it. As author Lawrence Peterson notes, classic cyberpunk characters were marginalized, alienated loners who lived on the edge of society in generally dystopic futures where daily life was implicated by rapid technological change, a ubiquitous datasphere of computerized information, and invasive modification of the human body. Technology in the Jetsons is presented as more of a source of annoyance than it is alienation, if we're being honest. Technology in the Jetsons is neither humanity's savior nor its downfall. It merely exists. As much as I know that's because of a conservative attempt at normalizing the atomic family, projecting it throughout all of time, there is something horrifyingly true to life about it for me. Cyberpunk is often described as technology advancing while society regresses, but we don't need society to regress for the horrible inequality of cyberpunk dystopias to exist. We just need things to stay kind of the same. Women, people of color, queer folk, and disabled individuals are often left out of technological revolutions, and consumer technology is more widely available to an affluent ruling class than any marginalized groups. The heralds of the future tend to be middle-aged, clean-cut white guys, always, from Walt Disney to Steve Jobs to Daddy. The future is almost always depicted as the debate of white men, made for and by them. And this was much more sharply pronounced in the 1960s when the Jetsons was first produced. The Jetsons subtly calls attention to this disparity by showing us an excessively, comedically milquetoast future. Watching it from a modern perspective, the absence of people of color, queer folk, and those differently abled becomes really disquieting. And it's not because there's some secret genocide that happened right before we went into space or any other fan theory nonsense like that. It's because Orbit City was modeled after a post-war American suburb, which is to say, very white. And this is by design. In real life, redlining made it harder for people of color to get home loans and effectively kept those communities out of suburbs for decades. The father of the suburb, William Levitt, explicitly refused to sell houses to black or Jewish families. Even as explicitly racist policies were repelled, the inequities caused by them persist to this day and will likely persist far into the future, unfortunately. So of course the space-age suburban future of the Jetsons would look like Leave It to Beaver. That's what it was built to look like. In trying to normalize this kind of society, the Jetsons inadvertently reveals the absurdity of it. And that's low-key cyberpunk as fuck.